Hello everybody, welcome to Snyderman Teaches, the series where we look at historic events and their importance to modern society. If you have any ideas on what you would like me to cover next, please leave those in the comments down below, and I'll take a look at those. I have a special Halloween episode coming at you next month. This month was actually inspired by Tarot. I will leave her channel link in the description below. She has an awesome channel full of amazing gameplay. You better go check her out. It's pretty awesome. Today we are going to be looking at King Henry VIII. Okay, so before we look at the kingship of Henry VIII, we need to look at his younger life. He was actually the third child of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. He was not the original heir to the English throne. That actually falls onto his brother Arthur. So because young Henry did not have the pressures of being king or being groomed to be king, he spent a lot of time with his mother, who he developed a very close relationship with. He was taught pretty much everything. He was a very, very bright young boy. He was fluent in French, and we know he knew a little bit of Latin. He was a very, very bright young man, really full of life, and he liked to go play with his friends and do all the things that kind of normal children do. We know that young Henry had a love for theology, meaning that he really loved the idea of organized religion, and the Catholic Church was a big part of his life. That's going to become important later when we look at what Henry does with the Catholic Church. But Arthur himself is going to be used as a bargaining chip by his father. Arthur is going to marry or be positioned to marry Catherine of Aragon, the youngest surviving child of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. So this marriage was a bargaining chip. It was a political maneuver by Henry VII and the Spanish monarch as a way to kind of unite their two houses. Nothing really out of the ordinary for the day. And they get married, and unfortunately, after about 4-ish months of being married, at the age of 15, Arthur is going to die of a fever. And that is going to, one, put the alliance with Spain in jeopardy, which Henry VII is not a fan of. He wants that alliance, and he wants it bad. So he immediately turns to his son, who was 10 years old at the time, so much younger than is depicted here. He turns to Henry VIII, and he's like, hey, you know your brother's widow, who's a grown woman? Yeah, you're going to go ahead and marry her now. This arranged marriage with Henry and Catherine is going to pose a little bit of a problem from a biblical religious perspective. In Leviticus, there are verses that talk about how a man cannot marry or have relationships with his brother's widow. And that goes directly against what Henry VII is trying to do, trying to position young Henry to marry Catherine to maintain this allegiance with Spain. And so instead of just saying, oh, this isn't going to happen, Henry VII actually goes to the Pope and says, hey, I want my son to marry his brother's widow. And the Pope agrees. Now, I'm sure that there was some sort of money exchange. The corruption and the activities of the Catholic Church at this point are a conversation we could have in another video, but the point is, ultimately, the Pope agrees to this arrangement. Henry himself is a little hesitant at first, and he actually does not agree to marry Catherine until after Henry VII's death. Okay? It is only then that he agrees he will marry Catherine, and the two end up becoming the king and queen of England. And actually the marriage itself was really, really good. Unusually good is the words that are usually used. And it's well documented that Henry VIII was very, very fond of Catherine. He was very much in love with her. And so the marriage itself was not bad. But Henry also had designs on a few things. One, conceiving an heir, make sure that his lineage continues. And two, gaining more power, gaining more control. Now, that's not to say Henry was a power-hungry individual. Actually, very early on in his reign, he was actually a very kind and generous king. He was so kind and so generous that he puts England on the verge of bankruptcy. He gives pretty much everybody that visits him whatever they want, and that has its strain on the royal books of England. And the court of England actually tries to limit Henry's power until a friar steps in, the cardinal in England for the Catholic Church steps in and is like, dude, you're king. You can do whatever you want. And Henry's just like, whoa. That means I can go to war with France. Okay? And so Henry kind of renews this big ancient rivalry with France, going to war with their old rival. And he gets the help of Catherine's nephew, Charles V. Charles V and Henry, they stage a dual invasion of France. Henry actually leads the English invasion of France himself and has a few minor victories. The biggest one is at the Battle of Spurs. Unfortunately, he was expecting some help from Charles, and Charles is like, oh, yeah, sorry, I totally forgot. I'll get you next time. And then the next time, Henry again leads his troops into battle, again wins, again there's no Charles. Meanwhile, back in England, B.A. Catherine is actually leading her British army or English army against a Scottish rebellion, so we got a little warrior queen action going on. But again, Charles is like, ooh, yeah, sorry, Henry, I'll get you next time. And Henry's like, I despise you. You are so annoying. I don't care if you're my wife's nephew. Fast forward to about a year later, Charles leads his troops into France, has some big victories. Henry's like, hey, so I can be the king of France like we agreed to, right? And Charles says, no. To which Henry responds with, I hate you, you big-chinned, ugly, inbred man. And this is actually where we see the beginning of the downward spiral of Henry VIII. It's this that is going to lead to Henry beginning to look at his marriage and really begin to question whether or not Catherine is the appropriate person for his failure to take control of the French throne, his failure to kind of sway Charles V, who was the king of Spain and the king of the Holy Roman Empire at the time, to kind of do his bidding, really ends Henry's dream of being this warrior king that is full of conquest. And so he turns himself more to a lifestyle of peace and wants to become this great peacemaker. He's influenced that way by the cardinal in England at the time, Cardinal Wolsey. And Henry ultimately signs a peace agreement with France that is going to last at least for a little while. And he's going to turn himself into more of a partier, more of a person that's going to have fun, but he's also going to turn into someone that becomes kind of gluttonous. He consumes about 5,000 calories every day, and we see his weight start to go up. And this is going to be a theme throughout the rest of his life. In the meantime, he actually becomes very angry and a little paranoid because Catherine has not conceived an heir, and she was unable, her status as queen was unable to secure a permanent alliance with Spain. So he starts to get a little bit more paranoid and a little bit disenchanted with his wife, and that's going to lead his eyes to travel elsewhere into the lady known as Anne Boleyn. Anne is a handmaiden of Catherine at this point, and there's speculation that an affair was going on between these two prior to these events, but here's what we do know. Anne didn't want to just be one of Henry's mistresses. Her eyes were on being queen. She wanted to be the Queen of England. And so she wouldn't let Henry get what he wanted, aka her in his bed, before she became queen. And so now Henry has to figure out a way to get Anne Boleyn to be his queen. And so he turns to the Catholic Church. He turns to Cardinal Wolsey and he says, okay, I need a divorce from my wife. It needs to be done quickly and quietly. This can't be a big scandal. I just need a divorce from my wife. The cardinal writes a letter to the Pope, who was under the thumb of Charles V at the time. And Henry's marriage, his divorce, becomes a European-wide scandal. Henry goes to court before the Catholic Church and is like, look, Leviticus says right here that a brother should not be able to have relations with his brother's widow, and if he does, then he's going to be childless. This is why I don't have an heir. This is why I need a divorce. This is the solution. And the church is like, okay, yeah, his point makes sense. His point makes sense. Until Charles V gets a hold of some love letters that Henry wrote to Anne Boleyn. And these are very suggestive love letters. It's very suggestive that Henry was just wanting to get Anne into bed. And when the Pope gets wind of this, his response to Henry's divorce is, no. I'm not going to grant you your divorce. And Henry says, okay, so I'm just going to take England and we are going to create our own church. We're going to break off from Catholicism. Thank you very much. Which was not unheard of at this point. This is the time of the Reformation, where Martin Luther had nailed 95 reasons that the Catholic Church was corrupt onto the church's door. So there is a history, a recent history, that Henry VIII can fall back on to kind of break the relationship that England had with the church at the time. It's also very well noted that Anne Boleyn was very outspoken. she was a very outspoken Protestant woman who was very combative against the Catholic Church. And so this also kind of spurs Henry's decisions. And so Henry basically makes the claim that being under the rule of the Pope, being under the rule of the Catholic Church, is really destroying the independence of the British country. It's really tying the British government down politically, and is an alliance that is more one-sided and is not in the best interest for the English. Sounds very similar to Brexit. So maybe we can connect Brexit and the ideas behind Brexit back to the fire in between Henry's legs, his burning loins that wanted to get Anne into bed. I don't know. You tell me. But either way, Henry breaks off from the Catholic Church. He creates the Church of England, and he marries Anne Boleyn after he gets his divorce from Catherine. And originally, the marriage was fine. It was really good. It was very calm, very quiet. Henry was continuing to balloon up and get bigger and bigger, consuming his 500 or 5,000 calories a day. And eventually, though, he grows tired of Anne Boleyn's outspoken nature. He grows tired of her being argumentative with him all the time. He grows tired of her being so outspoken, and he's like, I am the king. I can do what I want. And the relationship starts to turn a little rocky. Eventually, what we see happen is they do conceive a child. So Anne does become pregnant. Henry then one day is jousting with his friends. He gets knocked off of his horse and has a very major head injury. Very, very major head injury. And this causes Anne to go into a state of shock because it sounds like Henry is going to die. It's very likely that he was not going to make it past his injuries, and she goes into shock, and the resulting shock causes her to miscarry about 15-ish weeks into the pregnancy. And this puts a further strain on Henry and Anne's relationship, and Henry becomes even more paranoid after his accident. He also now has this wound that has opened up in his leg, and he has a very ulcered, pus-filled wound that isn't very desirable. Hard to be this big, strong, virile man when you are very, very much disgusting, stinky, smelly, etc. So it's very likely that in the meantime, Anne's eyes begin to wander, and she is accused of adultery. She is accused of having an affair with 5 different men. One of those is her own brother, and she is executed. She is beheaded at the order of King Henry VIII, along with her 5 perceived boyfriends. But Henry very quickly turns his attention to a lady in waiting, another handmaiden of the Queen, a lady by the name of Jane Seymour. And not a whole lot is known about this relationship other than she does give birth to Henry's son, Edward. But during this time, she dies. There are complications in childbirth, and Jane Seymour ends up passing away. And so what should be Henry's jubilation, what should be one of the greatest moments of his life, he finally has an heir, is now also victimized by the death of his wife. And this is something that is going to throw Henry into mourning for 2 years. 2 years. Henry is going to mourn the death of the lady that gave him a son. And after 2 years, they're like, yo, Henry, you have got to get a wife, buddy. We can't have you queenless. We need to get you more heirs, more sons. You've got to do this. And so he picks a German lady by the name of Anne of Cleves. And speculation runs rampant about what exactly happened. We know that Henry was enamored with the beauty of her portrait. That's the only time he had ever seen her prior to her coming to England and them getting married, is her painting. And we don't know whether the painting was done in just a super flattering way. We aren't sure. But we know that when 17-year-old Anne arrives in England, Henry is less than pleased. And by the way, Henry's a 49-year-old man at this point, so it's kind of weird anyway. So Henry is less than pleased. He is quoted as saying that she's ugly, smelly, when in reality he might be smelling himself, because again, ulcered leg, you have a whole bunch of physically deteriorating things happening within Henry's body that could be leading to his paranoia and leading to all of his psychological breaks that we're talking about here. But really, he's like, yeah, she's not what I was promised. I need another divorce. And he goes to court, the court of the Church of England, and he asks for a divorce. Anne agrees. She agrees to the separation, saying that the marriage had never been consummated. They had never done anything. And the church then agrees to the divorce. Okay? In the meantime, Henry has also had eyes on Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard is the first cousin of Anne Boleyn, and she is someone that Henry had his eyes on for a while, and they get married the day after Henry's divorce of Anne of Cleves, and everything seems to be going well for a while until rumors of Catherine Howard's adultery begin to spread. And at first, Henry doesn't want to believe this. Henry does not want to believe that his wife would be cheating on him, even though throughout his life he had hundreds of mistresses. He didn't want to believe that she would cheat on him. And it took 5 different people saying the same thing to him and a confession by one of her side guys to convince Henry that yes, she's having an affair. Catherine is then beheaded. She is accused of adultery and found guilty and beheaded. Henry is distraught. He is kind of seeing his legacy slip away here until he meets Catherine Parr, his final wife. Catherine Parr is a very outspoken lady. She is a very, very interesting woman in the sense that she was able to debate Henry and even convince Henry that, the Catholic Church is not necessarily all bad, but it's not all great either. She is able to reconcile Henry with his 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. They're going to become important later in this story. But she is the one that is going to kind of be there at the end of Henry's life. Henry has one more push into France that he makes. He leads a successful battle into France, But again, England is on the verge of bankruptcy, so his military campaign is stalled out, and Henry never conquers France. He then, very soon after, dies, leading Catherine to be the surviving queen. Edward the Sixth is going to be Henry's heir, so Henry's son is going to be the successor. But he dies 5 years later, and that is going to lead us into the legacy or the aftermath. Is really found in a few places. First of all, it's going to be his daughters. First, Mary takes over after Edward's death, and she kind of transitions England back towards the Catholic Church. But at the end of her reign, Elizabeth is actually going to take the throne, and she is going to really create a more modern context into England being a Protestant country. So modern Britain religion and modern Britain policy and government are really going to be tied to the policies and the decisions of Henry VIII. On top of that, when you look at Henry as a historic figure, he had a goal of going down in history. And even though his conquests failed and he was never really able to conceive a true heir, a true male heir to his throne, the bloodline actually dies with Elizabeth I because none of his kids ever had any heirs to call their own. So he has all these failures, yet he still goes down in history because when you think about the way he was able to assert himself over pretty much everybody that he met, or attempted to assert himself over everyone that he met, that kind of comes to epitomize and personify what we think of today as being a king, being this great monarch ruler. And a lot of modern British heritage is traced back to that. And so that's the impact of Henry VIII today. With that, this has been Snyderman Teaches. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you're not already. Leave me a comment. I enjoy reading those. And have a great day. We'll see ya.